Picture this. Germany, June 20th, 1948. You go to bed with 100,000 Reichsmarks in the bank. You wake up and find they are worth zero. The government has issued every citizen exactly 40 new Deutschmarks. Everyone from the janitor to the industrialist is now equal. By the end of this video, you will understand the mechanics of a currency reset and the one asset class that the German government was mathematically unable to reset. That is the emotional truth of the morning, even if the legal mechanics were slightly more complicated. On 20th June 1948, the Western occupation zones introduced the Deutsche Mark. Residents received an initial 40 DM, followed later by another 20. From 21 June, the Deutsche Mark became the sole legal tender. Ordinary payments like wages, salaries, rents, and insurance were largely carried over at 1001. Savings were not. To understand why that felt like annihilation, you have to begin before the exchange window opened. Post-war Germany was not living inside a functioning money system. It was living inside a shortage economy. Goods were rationed. Official prices were fiction. The Reichsmark still existed on paper, but trust in it had already died. Cigarettes circulated as money. Barter did the real work. Shop shelves were often bare, not because nothing existed, but because sellers had no reason to surrender real goods for a currency everybody expected to lose value. Then, in one weekend, the authorities changed the unit, and that is the first rule of a currency reset. The destruction does not begin when the law is announced. It begins years earlier, when money stops performing its social function and survives only as an accounting habit. What happened in Germany in 1948 was not simply monetary reform. It was a forced sorting operation between paper claims and real life. The official story of every currency reform is always moral, hygienic, almost surgical. There is too much money. Markets are distorted. Honest trade has retreated. A clean unit must be introduced so productive life can begin again. All of that was true in West Germany in 1948. It was also incomplete, because a currency reset is never just a technical repair. It is a political decision about which claims from the old world deserve to survive into the new one. That is why redenominations, conversions, and monetary stabilizations tend to reward the underaccumulated and punish the paper saver. Not because poverty is virtuous, and not because thrift is immoral, but because the state facing a monetary overhang has a problem of arithmetic. It cannot honor every nominal claim created in the old unit without importing the old disorder into the new system. So it has to choose. In 1948, the choice was stark. Current obligations needed continuity. People had to be paid. Rent had to be legible. Businesses had to reopen. Daily life required a functioning medium of exchange on Monday morning, not a seminar on fairness. So wages, salaries, pensions, rents, and many recurring payment streams were converted broadly at 101. But accumulated monetary balances were treated differently. Much of that stored paper wealth was heavily discounted, with portions first transferred into restricted accounts before later reductions. That is the hidden moral logic of the reset. The broke man with a skill, a wage, and no large bank balance is easier to carry into the new system than the prudent clerk who spent 20 years accumulating nominal claims in a dead currency. The debtor can be normalized. The saver has to be haircut. So when people say a currency reform makes everyone equal, that is wrong in the forensic sense. It does not make everyone equal. It redraws the hierarchy. It strips stored purchasing power from one class and hands relative advantage to those whose lives depend more on present income, inventory, tools, relationships, and hard assets than on bank ledgers. The reform does not erase inequality. It changes the winners. And once you see that, the rest of the story becomes much darker, because now we can ask the real question. Exactly how was fixed income wealth carved down line by line until decades of disciplined saving became a fraction of itself? Now we can look at the blade itself. The 1948 reform did not simply replace one currency with another. It ranked Claims. First, there was a psychological theater. Each resident received 40 Deutschemarks, later followed by another 20. That gave the reform legitimacy at street level. It meant market life could restart immediately. You could buy food, you could pay for transport. A shopkeeper could open the door and accept money that might still be worth something tomorrow. Then came the accounting reality. Wages, salaries, rents, pensions, and many running obligations were largely translated at 1/5. That was not generosity. It was systems maintenance. If pay packets had been cut by 90% overnight, the new currency would have begun its life in revolt. The authorities needed continuity in labor, housing, and routine exchange. So current flows were protected, stored balances were not. Substantial Reichsmark cash and bank deposits were converted at a much harsher rate. The broad outcome for many accumulated balances was effectively about 5 Deutschmarks for every 100 Reichsmarks, with part of the converted amount initially frozen in blocked accounts and later cut again. The Bundesbank's own historical summary states the result plainly. Savings were hit hard, and substantial Reichsmark balances ultimately ended up converted at less than 1,010, in many cases effectively 10,000. 65 after the blocked account reductions. That means the careful saver was not merely inconvenienced. He was reclassified. Imagine the pre-war widow with fixed income securities. Imagine the municipal clerk who never speculated, never owned a factory, never had access to black market inventory, and kept his life savings in a bank account because that was what respectable people did. The new regime did not accuse him of wrongdoing. It simply informed him that the monetary world in which his prudence made sense no longer existed. This is why fixed income wealth suffers first in a reset. A bond is a promise denominated in the old logic. A savings balance is a delayed claim on future goods. But when the state concludes that too many paper claims exist relative to real output, those claims become politically negotiable. They can be discounted, blocked, delayed, or extinguished in the name of stabilization. The saver discovers that safe meant legible to the system, not protected from the system. And here's the deeper cruelty. The haircut did not fall randomly. It fell hardest on people whose wealth was abstract, registered, patient, and obedient, not the reckless, not always the indebted, not even necessarily the poor. It fell on those who believed that nominal accumulation inside official channels was the same thing as durable security. That is the lesson most modern viewers miss. In a reset, the state does not ask who behaved responsibly. It asks which claims can survive without breaking the replacement currency. And once that question is asked, paper wealth is already on trial. The only remaining issue is which forms of value stand outside the kill zone. So who survived? Not emotionally, not morally, financially. The people who came through the reform best were not necessarily the richest men on paper before it happened. They were the people holding Sachwerte, real things. Productive property, inventories, tools, land, workshop equipment, durable goods, stakes in businesses that could still produce, transport, repair, mill, store, or sell. These were not immune to chaos, but they were not trapped in the same way as fixed nominal claims. That distinction changed the social order. This is the point many modern viewers miss when they hear 90% of wealth disappeared. No, paper claims disappeared. Usable wealth was repriced. A machine tool did not wake up on June 21 and become 1/10 of a machine. A warehouse of usable inventory did not become 1/10 of a warehouse. An apartment building still collected rent. A farm still produced food. A business with stock, supplier ties, and local demand could begin selling again the moment trusted money returned. In fact, one reason shelves suddenly refilled after the reform was that goods that had been withheld, diverted, or pushed into black markets moved back into open sale once a credible currency existed. That is why the new elite after a reset often does not look like the old elite. The old paper bourgeoisie clerks, bondholders, savers, annuity households can be crushed. Meanwhile, the owner of a repair shop, a trucking yard, a small factory, a timber lot, or a building with tenants may emerge battered but intact because his wealth is attached to function rather than denomination. The reset changes the unit of account. It cannot repeal scarcity. And here is the forensic principle underneath it. The state can redenominate money. It can haircut deposits. It can freeze accounts. It can rewrite bond terms. It can change reporting thresholds. It can even criminalize certain transactions. What it cannot do cleanly is make a necessary real thing unnecessary. That does not mean every tangible asset is safe. Registered property can be taxed, seized, rent-controlled, or burdened. Businesses can fail. Land can become illiquid. Physical goods can be stolen. But in the currency event, the hierarchy is still clear. Claims on reality tend to survive better than claims on a ledger. That is the survival gap. And once you understand that gap, the modern question stops being, will they do exactly what Germany did in 1948? The real question becomes, what version of this logic would a debt-saturated modern state choose now? Now we make the modern pivot carefully, because bad history creates bad preparation. The United States is not a Weimar Germany. It is not occupied post-war West Germany. It does not need to hand out paper starter balances on a Sunday night and reopen shops on Monday morning. The dollar remains the world's dominant reserve currency, and U.S. public debt is financed inside a far deeper, more liquid financial system than the one Germany had in 1948. As of March 13, 2026, total U.S. public debt outstanding stood at about $38, $9 trillion. That is an immense burden, but scale alone does not tell you the form of the adjustment. So when I say high debt states drift toward a zero removal logic, I do not mean America is about to announce a literal 1948-style overnight currency exchange. I mean something more important. When debt loads become politically difficult and financially heavy, states look for ways to reduce the real weight of their obligations without using the word default. The modern toolkit is broader. Inflation above wage growth, negative real returns on safe assets, tax changes, regulatory steering of savings into government paper, selective restructuring, benefit formula revisions, and administrative changes in what counts as protected value. IMF work on rising debt pressures and domestic debt restructuring makes the point in institutional language. High debt systems eventually confront burden-sharing decisions, and those decisions are never neutral. That is the contemporary version of the same old question. Which claims will the state preserve because daily life depends on them? And which claims will it quietly dilute because the system cannot honor them in full? In 1948, that answer took the form of an open conversion regime. In a modern developed economy, it is more likely to arrive as a slower administrative suffocation of paper wealth rather than a single theatrical reset. The saver may not wake up to a new banknote. He may wake up year after year to the same account statement, purchasing less, yielding less, and obeying more rules. That is why the lesson from 1948 is not watch for a surprise new currency. The lesson is harsher. Watch for the moment the state begins distinguishing between nominal claims it can tolerate and real claims it cannot manufacture. So what is the protocol? Not panic, not cosplay, not fantasies about escaping the grid with gold coins in a basement. The forensic record gives a narrower answer. Before any reset, overt or disguised, reduce your dependence on assets whose value exists mainly because a financial system continues to recognize them at full face value. Increase exposure to things with direct utility, low maintenance burden, and persistent demand under stress. Productive tools. Useful inventories. Selected precious metals. Essential spares. Durable household resilience. In some cases, productive land or a small business tied to necessities. The common trait is not glamour. It is that they remain meaningful even if the unit changes. This is historical pattern recognition, not a guarantee. Tangible assets can be taxed, stolen, regulated, or become illiquid. Registered property is not invisible. Nothing is invulnerable. The checklist is simple. Which of your assets is a promise? Which is an entry in someone else's system? Which depends on unchanged rules? Which remains useful if trust breaks for 6 months? Which one would a government find easiest to reprice, freeze, report, or dilute? That is the dividing line. Do not be the person holding old paper and calling it safety, because the statement still prints cleanly. History offers only 2 positions. You either store part of your life in forms the system cannot cheaply multiply, or you volunteer to be converted with the ledger.